Hello, and thank you for listening to the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and joining me this week is Zoe Harcombe. Zoe has a really interesting background. She did not come from nutrition, but now has published many books, and her favorite pastime, like we get into in the show, is one of mine, which is calling people on bullshit on health and nutrition claims. She does so on Twitter and is just a beast at it. So we talk a lot about many nutrition myths and why they're ridiculous, nutrition policy, how it differs from the USA and the UK. Tons of interesting stuff in this episode, so tune in and I hope you enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about the ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Zoe, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So your background is pretty amazing, and I always love the chance to get to speak with people who have, interest in health and interest in nutrition, especially who are not classically trained in that field. Just because I feel like a lot of people have certain dogmas when it comes to health and nutrition, if they've sort of been through this didactic path since they were young. So maybe just give a little bit of your background and how you got started in your career in general, and how maybe nutrition became a highlight for you as you progress through your career.
Yeah, sure. So I think I was the first person from my school to graduate from Cambridge University. So that was a path that hadn't been trodden before me. I did the entrance exam in maths, and then I changed to economics pretty soon after arriving there because the mathematicians were unbelievable. But I did then do all the maths options. So maths is my love. I just love numbers. And when I was graduating from Cambridge at the time, the companies that were going after the Oxbridge students were the merchant bankers, the city financiers, and management consultancy firms, which had really just started taking off. So people like L.E.K. Bain, Booz Allen, all that kind of thing. And I just couldn't face going into the city. It just seemed soul destroying. And so I went into management consultancy, and I did that, traveling all over the place for about 3 years. And then, confession time, I saw an advert for an organization called Mars. And Mars, of course, make confectionery. They also made electronics, and I got an offer from the electronics division.
The same company makes electronics as they make
bars?
I had no idea.
And this is a great story, because if you remember when you used to put money in a vending machine 20, 30 years ago, you never got your money back and you never got the product out. You would see them at trains. You may be too young. You'd see them at train stations or something, and you try and buy a chocolate bar or something, and it would steal your money. So Mars realized that if they wanted to be able to sell confectionery 24/7, they needed to develop a reliable coin mechanism. So Mars Electronics was born. So I started working in manufacturing when I joined Mars, working in their coin mechanism division. And I was with Mars for about 6 years. It is one of the best companies in the world that you could ever work for. It is just a tragedy that the product is not something I could endorse anymore. I'm not sure I liked it very much at the time. There was just too much chocolate all around wherever you worked. They used to joke, you'll join Mars and you'll gain a stone within a month or so. It's like, no, this is not a great place to work. And then really put the icing on the cake, left the confectionery company. I was headhunted by SmithKline Beecham. So went from one drug to another drug. And then moved for personal reasons to Wales. I've been with my hubby for 20 years, and some fabulous organisations I work for in Wales. So I started off in telecoms, working for Wales's richest man, Terry Matthews. I then worked for the Welsh Development Agency in development, basically inward investment into Wales, trying to get the gross domestic product of Wales up to that of the UK average. And then I worked for Welsh Water, which was a not-for-profit organisation, and did really well in my career, really did enjoy it. I ended up as global head of human resources for many of these organisations, responsible for people absolutely all over the place, loved it, but also had a sort of parallel interest going alongside. And that was understanding why we had this obesity problem, why people find themselves eating foods that they don't want to be eating when they're trying to lose weight. So I became fascinated by food cravings, food addiction, obesity, diet, weight loss, et cetera, et cetera.
And did that come from digging into the economic impact that you were trying to change, or how did you sort of see that as a parallel to what you were doing? Or was it just an interest in the side?
Yes, no, the nutrition interest actually came first. So my brother was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 15 and I was 13. And that changes the family environment overnight. It didn't change the diet anywhere near as much as it should have done, because, of course, as we now know, the wrong dietary advice has been given for diabetes, both types, for a very long period of time. But it did get us to realize the difference between sugar and insulin and the equal and opposites, and what happens if he's in a hypo versus what happens if he's in a hyper state. Then, like most females, had a fairly bad relationship with food during my teens and certainly going up to Cambridge University. I became the women's officer up there before I became the college president. And I remember we got some training on eating disorders, and I went back to the college, and they'd only just admitted women the year before I joined. So there were only about 20 women in a college of about 200, and the college had been around for 600 years before they figured that women were worth admitting, by the way, and took all this information back to my peers, thinking nobody's going to be interested. It's only me who's sitting eating crisps and ice cream when I don't want to be doing that. And every single one of the females said, yeah, please, can I have a look at this information? Because, of course, it's classic, isn't it? High achievers, eating disorders, not having a good relationship with food.
Right.
So that then started my interest in overeating. Why are we craving particular things? Why are we driven to eat carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates? And also this fat-carb combo, which I later realized doesn't happen in the natural world. It happens really rarely. So you've got nuts and seeds that are fat-carb combos, but you just don't otherwise have that within nature. And yet in the fake food world, it's just everywhere: ice cream, cakes, cookies, etc.
Yeah, dairy, I think, is the only other one that I can think of besides nuts.
Sorry, what was that?
Dairy is the only one that I can think of.
Yeah, full fat dairy, yes. Probably more fat than carb. But certainly, yes, when you get into the fluid dairy, you're getting into that kind of carb combo, fat carb combo. So yes, that's another one. But they're arguably not the most natural foods in our environment. And the staples of the fat proteins, the animal foods, the things that the vegans don't eat, and then the carb proteins, the things that the vegans do eat, they're quite starkly differentiated in nature. So you've got the stuff from the fields and you've got the stuff from the animals. But of course, fake food has turned all that upside down. So I kind of had a book in me when I left Cambridge, but it was a number of years later. I was enjoying my career and I was on a training program, and we committed to the person that we buddied up with that we were going to do something that we'd been meaning to do for ages. And my buddy said she was going to get fit, and I said I was going to write a book that I'd always wanted to write. And we both did what we said we were going to do. So that was 2004. That was my first book. Thought nothing more of it. Then the publisher came back and said, can you write a couple more? That was 2007. And then 2008, of course, the economic world fell apart. And I got the opportunity to leave corporate life and took it. And I now do what I do now, which is just as enjoyable, if not more so. So I've been pretty fortunate. So
you've been pretty prolific, I think, since that first book. Is there, you said you had interest when you were in Cambridge. Was it just to write a book and to tackle that as a kind of an accomplishment? Or is there, subjects that you wanted to do? Or is it the fascination of learning that deeply? What was the trigger that kind of pushed you down that route?
Yeah, it was less ever wanting to write a book. I never sit down and think, oh, wouldn't it be fun to write a book? It isn't that much fun. It's a lot easier once you've written one. But it was more that I wanted to understand. So my first book was called Why Do You Overeat When All You Want Is to Be Slim? And that's what I was trying to understand. I couldn't work out why I personally was eating biscuits when I knew they made me fat, and I knew they made me feel really bad, and I knew they made me want to eat more biscuits. And I just couldn't work out why I was doing this. So I really wanted to understand what was going on with food cravings. And in my first job after Cambridge, I had the real good fortune to be positioned over in the States. So my first job was over in Boston. I was on my own. I was 21 years old. They were working stupid hours. If I ever got an hour off, I would just go to the nearby bookshop and they would have a Starbucks in there and you could read a book and have your Starbucks. And it was really nice when you didn't know anyone to spend the evening in that way. And I started reading things about food intolerance and hypoglycemia, which of course is incredibly well known now, but back in the 90s, far less well known. And then things like gut flora and how gut flora can impact food cravings and general well-being and mental fog and all this kind of stuff. So I was really looking at this a long, long time ago, trying to piece it all together. And then I guess the first diet book that I wrote came out of that, because when you look at the literature, whole books that have been written by doctors on things like food intolerance and hypoglycemia, and you look at the kind of foods that they were recommending, it's so core to the kind of stuff that is just mainstream now, whether you call it keto or low carb or Banting or LCHF or just real food, but choose the nutrients carefully and then you'll end up low carb, which is kind of my approach. But they were all tending down the same road, which was the foods that are going to be safe for you with any of these conditions are meat and fish and eggs, dairy products less so, vegetables, particularly non-starchy. There was a bit of debate over grains. Natural live yogurt seemed to be a good thing generally for the gut flora. And that was about it. And that was the core diet. And so I put that together in the first book, said it probably only needs to be about 5 days long just to kick some of the food cravings, because that's how long it takes for food to clear the body. And if you're particularly craving something, as soon as it's out of your system, it actually seems to be easier to say no to it. And then I put my email in the first book. I thought, 10 people will read this or something. And then started getting emails from people saying, I've lost 10 pounds, I've lost 12 pounds, I've stopped my food cravings. And it was just really, really lovely to receive those, to think, great, I've managed to help myself. I've now managed to help a few other people. And that just feels really good. So I guess that then started me doing more of what I try to do at the moment.
Amazing. So when it came down to stopping cravings, like you said, did you find out in working, in hearing from people and reading these books that it's a very clear mechanism? As I know a lot of people have a lot of different hypotheses on how to break food cravings. What is your view on this point?
I think it's physical and emotional. And I think it has historically been particularly emotional for females, but I think men are catching up women. And it therefore may be a stress thing, or it may be a pressure to be slim thing, because I think there's far less difference now between the pressure put on males and females to look in a particular way. So on the physical reasons for craving, it did come down to those three conditions. So if you have a food intolerance, you ironically almost crave the thing to which you're intolerant. So you might start off having a muffin on the way into work, and then suddenly you realize you need 2 muffins a day. You need one at morning break as well. And then 2 doesn't seem to cut it. And then you want muffins to the exclusion of other things. So it's, I'll have a muffin for lunch instead of my salad or whatever. And people can get that addicted to particular foods. It's never salmon and green beans or steak and kale. It is these fake foods that have this fat carb combo. And then, of course, if you look at things like hypoglycemia, because it's so difficult to maintain that 4 grams of glucose in the bloodstream at any one time, we have even a third of an apple, let's say, let alone a confectionery bar. Blood glucose shoots out of the top of the range. The body tries to get insulin to get it back to normal. Let's say it doesn't quite manage it perfectly. And suddenly you're slightly below where you want to be. And then you're in that hypoglycemic state. And then the body tells you to go out and eat. And when you explain that to people, they realize, oh my goodness, that's why when I start eating chocolate, I can't stop. I feel great for half an hour and then I want another bar of chocolate. And that's why on the days when I manage not to have chocolate, I actually feel far more even in energy and far less likely to want to go and get a bar of chocolate. So I think there's all of that going on the physical side. And then on the emotional side, it has just been drummed into us since almost the day that we're born. That the first thing that goes wrong, we're being fed in some way. Then we get to toddle around, we bang ourselves, we get given something sweet to cheer us up. We've got birthdays, we've got Christmas, we've got Halloween, we've got all the celebrations at school. We go to the local fete, you go to festivals, you go to the cinema, you go to the ball game. There is this constant association between sweet, crap, junk equals feel good, cheer me up. And we're ingrained to see it as a treat.
Do you think that just emerged because the dopamine feedback loop is so quick? And we just wanted to associate good things with that quick hit of dopamine? Is that the hypothesis?
There's that as well. I mean, it is absolutely indisputable that having sugar makes you feel good almost immediately. You get a sugar rush, you get a sugar buzz. You can see it in a child astonishingly quickly. It's within seconds. And yes, there's obviously stuff going on in the brain. There's stuff flooding into the blood glucose system, which momentarily might feel good and then very, very quickly doesn't feel quite so good. So that there is all of that physiologically going on. But there's also this, Halloween is great fun, and you knock on the door and you get a treat, and birthdays are treats, and you fall over and that will make you feel better. There's such an emotional, ingrained behavior that goes on with junk and this idea of things being treats, which is why I always call them cheats, not treats. And I think it's a really important distinction, because when you're trying to help an adult to lose weight and they've had maybe 30 years of thinking sweet stuff is going to cheer me up, it's going to make me feel good, and then their boss is mean to them or the kids are playing up, the first thing that pops into their head is, I need something to cheer me up. And they reach for something sweet, something that's going to make them diabetic and obese. And it's not what they want to be doing. So it can help. Language is so important. It can help very, very quickly to say to them, this is not a treat. This is actually being really, really nasty to yourself. So this is a cheat from healthy eating. And that's fine if you want to do that. But you have to make it a conscious choice. You have to know why you're doing it. You have to know what the consequences are going to be. You need to put a pause in between reaching for that bad thing and being really absolutely sure that this is what you want to do.
Yeah.
And break that, it's a treat, I'll feel good, and that's not going to help.
Well, I think that happens even when you don't eat cheat foods. Like I was experimenting myself last year with the carnivore diet, and one of the things that I recognized after 5 weeks of it, and really simplifying my food choices and only eating meat and animal products, is that when I was getting stressed throughout work, or if I was just bored or didn't want to do the thing I was doing, I would wander over to the fridge and eat something and something that's easily snacked on. Even if I have the best food choices, that's going to add up over time, eating that many times throughout the day and just snacking on things because I want to snack on them. I realized when I was doing that, I think that's one of the biggest things of doing a really restrictive diet. Yeah, it's not fun, but then you start realizing your emotional relationship to food a little more clearly.
Yes. And finding other props. So when we say to people, when you're going to lose your best friend, when you realize that you've been using food as a prop and you've been, and it works very effectively, almost like alcohol. You can get into a carbohydrate stupor in just the same way that you can be alcoholically drunk. And yet you'll be charged if you're drunk in charge of a vehicle. You won't be charged if you're effectively drunk on carbohydrates, which I've seen many, many people be, because it does just mess up with your head so much. Your sugar's all over the place. 1 minute you're manic, next minute you're on the floor. You are not responsible for that vehicle during that period of time. It's really quite scary. So you're saying to people, you're going to lose all of that. You're going to lose the thing that you're going to reach for when you're upset. And I run through all the emotions in the Why Do You Overeat book as well: the guilt, the anger, sadness, things that trigger us to want to go and get something. As you say, boredom, that's a classic one. Complacency can be quite an interesting one. I'm doing really well on my diet. I'm sure if I have a muffin, I'll be fine. And then you're not. It reawakens the desire to have muffins several times a day. So it's just trying to connect with adults in an adult way, to say you don't have to respond now as the child did for the first 18 years. That was really bad adult training for you. Please don't do that with your own children. But now you are where you are. You just need to break all of those connections and make what you do from here on in a conscious choice. But I do think you need a different prop. And I'd be interested to see what you came up with when you had your boredom at work or stressed or tackling the next part of the big project and you can't reach for food. Did you find another option?
Well, I think there's two ways to go about it. And I think that one, as far as when you're looking at habit loops, you can just replace it with something else. Or I think if it's hard enough to do the thing, you just stop doing it. And so I didn't cook my food ahead of time. So every time I wanted to have a meal, I'd have to cook, I'd have to get out the pan, I'd have to get the animal product to room temperature, then I have to cook it, and then I have to clean, and I have to eat it. And so I think just removing that entirely for 6 weeks and not having the ability to have access to food, I think just broke it entirely. It's not like I went crazy or anything. The question I'd like to ask to you is, what have you found to work the best for people? Is it replacing food with something else? Is it just going cold turkey on items that the people are craving for? But what is the strongest thing people can do to break the cravings that they have?
That's a good question. I think knowledge helps so much. And probably the biggest feedback that I've had is people saying, I didn't realize why I was doing that, which is the question that I set out to answer, because I didn't realize why I was doing that. So when people understand that they're addicted to particular foods, that if they have the same food too much, too often, this association, this addiction, whatever, will develop with it. And they'll keep wanting it too much and too often and even more, because you actually educate them. You're going to feel bad if you don't have that food. So somebody who maybe is addicted to diet sodas, particularly the ones with caffeine, Diet Coke, and some of them, they might be having 10 a day. And then you say to them, okay, let's try to give up the Diet Coke. And the first day they feel so terrible. They may as well be a cocaine addict. That's how bad they feel. They're getting the caffeine withdrawal symptoms, the headaches. They're missing it. They're missing it physically as well as emotionally and as the whole prop. So to let them know that that's okay and that's what they're going to go through and why they're going through all of that, but that there is a better place at the other end. And then when people can get to that better place, they can just make much clearer choices because they're no longer in this addictive state. They're no longer head foggy. They're no longer lurching from sugar highs to lows. So I think knowledge is hugely important. And just holding the mirror up to people saying, do you notice that when your boss is mean to you, your first thought is to go to the vending machine? And when your kids are playing up, you've got that biscuit cupboard that you keep for such occasions. And quite often things become so habitual that it takes other people holding a mirror up for the person to say, do you know what? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I've never, ever experienced anyone not welcome the mirror being held up, because I think everybody, you're not judging because you've been there. I've been there. You're not criticizing in any way. You're just trying to genuinely help someone to say, hey, have you noticed that when this happens, you do this? And to change something, you've got to admit it. It's the Alcoholics Anonymous principle. You've got to admit that you've got the problem in the first place. And sometimes people don't actually know the problem that they have. But then when they do have it, you start giving them the tools to be able to overcome their problems.
Got it. So after Cravings, I know you came up with a little diet named after yourself. What is the tenet of the diet in the core principles that you have proposed?
Yeah, I didn't name it. I mean, it's my husband's name, obviously, because I got married. I didn't name it after me at all. So the first book was called Why Do You Overeat? When All You Want Is to Be Slim. A few years later, when the publisher said, hey, that one did okay, which at the time I realized doing okay for a book is about 2,000 copies. And I was still an HR director at the time, so that was fine. And the second one was called Stop Counting Calories and Start Losing Weight. And then a recipe book came out with that one. And then the publisher said, hey, we're getting people calling up or we're getting emails and people are saying, have you got the book on Zoe's diet or the Harcombe diet or something? So the publisher then said, I tell you what, when we put the next thing out, we'll just put Stop Counting Calories, Start Losing Weight, the Harcombe diet below it. It's like, yeah, fine, whatever.
Named from the fans.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite, I guess what's quite nice actually is when you get people approaching you on Facebook, because it's quite an unusual name. As I say, it's not my name, it's my husband's name, although I'm very happy to have it because that means I'm married to him. But you'll get somebody contacting you who's called Freddie Harcombe or something, and they'll say, hey, where are you and what's your heritage and have you traced it back? Because our name is not that common. So it's been quite nice to meet. We have actually connected with some cousins and second cousins and other distant relatives. So that's been quite fun.
And so when you published that one, was there a certain principle that you had that was maybe a little counterintuitive at the time? I know you mentioned the food choices before that you were talking about. Is it pretty much that list that you were saying?
Yes. So phase one of the diet ended up being, if you put together, and I just did this on the floor in the flat that I owned at the time, I just had books all around me on the gut flora stuff, food intolerance, food allergies, food cravings, hyperglycemia, low blood glucose. It came in all different names, had them all out on the floor, and then just looked to see, it's the maths again, it's the lowest common denominator. What is the core that all the doctors would agree with? These are the safe foods. And that ends up being quite nicely described by one of the pairings of doctors. I think it was Trowbridge and Walker that coined a little phrase called MEVI, which was meat and fish, eggs, vegetables, and Y for natural live yogurt, because they really did think that the natural live yogurt was going to be beneficial for these conditions. And I've certainly found it to be so, and not found it to be a problem unless people know that they're dairy intolerant. So that was the first basis of the diet. The second phase of the diet was actually based on this carb protein, fat protein meal principle, to try to encourage people not to mix, because it just doesn't happen that often in nature. So if you're going to have a carb meal, then have baked potato or brown rice with vegetable chili or vegetable curry. That's your vegetarian meal, or even a vegan meal. And if you're going to have a fat protein meal, then it's going to be animal-based, meat, fish, eggs, dairy. And again, you can have your vegetables. But it was trying to get people to the point of saying, if you've got your meat and your vegetables, you don't need the grain or the potato on the plate at the same time. You've got everything you need. And if you start having this unnatural fat carb combo, you'll be overeating because you just can. And you give people the example, if I give you a sourdough loaf and say, eat that on your own, on its own, you'll get to a certain position in the loaf and it's like, okay, I'm done. My mouth is quite dry. I've had enough. And if I said, okay, there's a pat of butter, see how much of that you want to eat. Again, it'd be like, okay, I've had I don't know, 50 grams, whatever. I'm done. Put the two together. You've got no limit because you're into that fake food world again. Right. And it was also about how the body uses fuel. So it was trying to get people into the idea of, if you have a carb meal, then you want the body to be using the carbohydrates that you've just eaten for fuel, because what you don't want to be doing is storing them for later on. And if you've got fat at the same meal, so if you have your potatoes and your steak, then the body's going to try to use the potatoes for immediate energy. Some of that goes straight into the bloodstream, gets taken out into glycogen, will come back in later on. Hopefully you'll get that used up before the next meal. But if you're having the fat proteins at the same time, the body's just going to say, well, I'll store that for later on. And it can store it for later on because you're eating all these carbs. So you're going to have insulin available, which is going to help you to store anything that the body wants to store for later on. So there was a second part to it. Don't overeat because of the mixing, but also let your body use up a carb meal if that's what you're going to have. And it kind of took people down the route of low carb without me ever thinking that low carb was a good thing. This was 15 years ago.
Interesting.
But people realized that they lost weight faster, they felt less hungry, more satiated, managed to get through to the next meal much easier when they had fat meals. And so we'll have people in our club saying they'll talk about fat meals and carb meals. And some of them that really, really get it worked out quite quickly. Fat meals just work. So I have bacon and egg for breakfast, or they'll have tuna salad for lunch, and then lamb and vegetables for dinner with some cheese, maybe some cream and some berries, and feel fantastically not deprived. Can't believe that they're losing weight. Can't believe that they've got even energy, feeling great because they're getting fantastic nutrients in such a day's eating, and they just get it. And Bob's your uncle. That's a British phrase, by the way. And then there are people who want the carb meals. So they want the porridge for breakfast. They want the baked potato and veggie chili for lunch. They want brown rice and butternut squash curry or something for dinner. And they realize that they're starting to feel hungry before the next meal. Weight loss is not so fast. And it's a great route to get people into low carb. It was never intended to be that, but we have a number of people who will then go off to do keto or Bantin and go what I would call pretty hardcore low carb because they just find that they enjoy it or it works better for them.
And so what's interesting is that being an American, I obviously am ashamed to say that I have no idea on the history of any other country when it comes to nutrition. So we obviously know the story of Ansel Keys here and how we have this huge fight still against getting fat to be something that can be consumed easily without people feeling like they're doing something wrong. Was the same thing happening in the UK? Was it as aggressive?
We had the hero. You had the villain. We had the hero.
Interesting.
So we had John Yudkin. We had Mr. Sugar.
Yeah, tell me about him.
Yeah, so we had Mr. Sugar, you had Mr. Fat. So, and they met a number of times, and they were contemporaries, and apparently they didn't like each other. I think Ansel Keys was particularly hostile to Yudkin. Yudkin less so, because Yudkin would have been a British gentleman of the time, a professor working out of university in London. It would be really, really surprising if he'd have been having a dig at anything. So the history books do paint it more as Ansel Keys was having a bit of a pop at John Yudkin. And Yudkin was saying that sugar is the problem, and Ansel Keys was saying, no, it's fat is the problem. And really, unfortunately, for the entire developed world, Yudkin lost out and Ansel Keys won. Had it been the other way around, and we'd realized back in the 1950s, 60s, actually sugar is the issue, not real fat in real natural foods, how different the course of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, maybe even, how different that could all have been.
Right. So did it happen where once American policies switched to promote low fat, high carb, did that then translate in UK accepted as well?
Yes. So this is now into the core of my PhD. So the government guidelines changed, obviously, in the US in 1977 with the Senator McGovern Committee, and in came effectively, as you say, the low fat, high carbohydrate guidelines. The UK then followed in 1983. There was a particular report written in that year. And then our main report, like your one, was then the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which started in 1980, and then every 5 years thereafter. So the COMA report, 1984, was the seminal report in the UK. And it pretty much followed the American guidelines verbatim. So one of the things that I say when I speak in conferences is a little known nutritional factoid is that protein tends to stay fairly constant in any natural diet. And I can give references for that either empirically or theoretically, but it just is a fact. And it tends to be around this 15%, can obviously go higher if you're having more of a meat, fish, egg, veg diet, but it's difficult getting it north of 30 or 40%. And you've got to be doing something pretty unnatural if you are. So if you work on it globally being about 15%, the minute you set a dietary fat guideline of 30% as an upper limit total fat, which is what came out of the Senator McGovern Committee, because you only eat three things, you've immediately then set a minimum limit of 55% on the carbohydrate. And that was almost the unintended consequence of setting the dietary fat guideline at 30%. We just set this carb minimum of 55%. And when you spell it out to people like that, they're like, oh yeah, so that's why we eat so much carbohydrate. Had we not demonized fat, we wouldn't have told people to eat so much carbohydrate. And my PhD was looking at the evidence at the time for the two dietary fat guidelines that came in, the 30% total fat, 10% saturated fat. So I looked back at the randomized controlled trials available to the American committee in 77 and then the British committee in 1983, and then looked just for completeness at the epidemiological studies available at the time. And the conclusion of the PhD was that there was no evidence supporting either of those dietary guidelines at the time. So the second part of the PhD was to bring it up to date and to look, so I was closing this at around 2016, look at all the evidence that was available then, and I found that there was no more evidence available then, even today, to say that we should limit our total fat to 30% or indeed our saturated fat to 10%. And that wasn't just me. One of the final papers from my PhD, which is on OpenView on the British Journal of Sports Medicine, if you put in my name and then dietary guidelines, have no evidence base, BJSM, you'll find the paper. And the paper then takes what I'd been looking at in the context of what everybody else had been doing. And you look at people like Schwing-Shackle and Hoffman, Siri-Torino, the Hooper, Cochrane studies, and who else was looking at it? Skiaf and Miller. So there were a number of other people, and they'd looked at different things from either total fat or saturated fat or swapping out saturated fat, swapping in unsaturated fat. They'd looked at mortality. They'd looked at cardiovascular disease mortality. They'd looked at coronary heart disease mortality. They looked at events. They'd looked at heart attacks. There were so many things that had been looked at. And in that final paper, I showed that there was something like 40 findings and only 3 actually came up with anything. And one of those was against trans fats. That was the Chowdhury paper from 2014. I won't disagree with that at all. And then the other two are the Hooper findings, which you will probably have people quote at you to say, oh, look, saturated fat is really bad. And those two findings were only for CVD events, not any of the mortalities that were going on. And when you look closely at the Hooper paper, and one of my colleagues in the UK, Dr Trudy Deakin, did this. I always credit her for spotting this. It's in the report. It's about page 157. There's a sensitivity test undertaken by Hooper, not just on the studies that intended to swap out saturated fat and put in unsaturated fat, but the studies that actually managed to do so, which is the genuine test, not what you intended to do, but did you actually manage it? And then even the CVD event finding falls away. And you end up with the totality of the evidence in the field of total fat and saturated fat comes down to there's an issue with trans fats. Trans fats are not good for us. Hey, tell me something I don't know. And that's it.
And so how has the journey been now to try to get, I mean, is your strategy sort of focus on Nutrition Coalition with, Nina Teicholz and those people to get things moving in the right direction in the US, assuming that that's going to tip the dominoes like it did before? Or are you sort of focused locally to where you're at, and how do you see this sort of reversing trend?
Do you know, I'm not a strategist in personality types, which obviously I explored a lot when I was an HR director. So in Myers-Briggs terms, if anyone knows Myers-Briggs, I'm an ESTP, which means I'd be a great private detective. I'm very good last minute. I'm spontaneous. You can chuck a presentation on me and I wouldn't mind at all. But if you say to me, what are you going to be doing in 5 years' time? I wouldn't have a clue because I just don't think about it. And used to get asked that question in interviews. And I used to think it was a failing not to know. And I now realize it's just a personality trait.
I'm an INTJ. That's probably why I'm asking you about the strategy.
That's so funny. So we should connect on the thinking level.
Yeah, sounds like it.
But do you know, this is the thing about Myers-Briggs. You often get on really well with people who are opposite types to you because you find them really interesting because they are opposite types to you. You should never surround yourself by people who are the same as you because then a few people are surplus to requirements. I always used to say when we were trying to encourage diversity in the workplace, if you've got two people in the same room thinking in the same way, then one of them is surplus to requirements. And that was one of Mars's principles. And then, of course, you get more women at the higher level, you get more ethnic minorities at the higher level, you get more disability at the high level, and so on. So Mars was well ahead on that. But back to the thing, I don't plan ahead. I don't have a strategy. I guess all my sort of mission statement or my reason for being or why what I want to be doing in the world is just as simple as making a difference in the lives of others. And that might be that you help somebody with a shopping trolley in the supermarket, or it might be that you go to a conference, as I did recently at my own expense, to help a lot of farmers because the farmers are under siege at the moment from vegans and fake meat and everything else. So it's just to try to help other people, to try to be a decent human being, to try to live by values that I would like to have around me in other people. And that means helping a lot of different people in this field. So I love to help the public health collaboration in the UK. I love to help Nina as much as I can. I think that there are, it's not what I think, as a fact, there are 3 levels at which we can effect change. One is the top down, which is what Nina's doing. And that's where we would actually change dietary guidelines. And I think that would have more effect than any of the other parts of the pyramid, because visualize this as a pyramid. Because immediately, if you can change the dietary guidelines, particularly in America, you change them worldwide, because they are now embedded in hospital food and school food and the military provisions. You would change the whole of the public sector and the dietary advice that is given absolutely everywhere. So that would make the biggest single difference. Nina is right to be going for that. At the bottom then is somewhere where I like to think I've been making a difference since writing the first book, because it's at the individual level. It's the bottom-up revolution that you're a part of, and anybody working in this field is a part of, because every person that talks to one other person is spreading the bottom-up revolution. Every person who said, this is what I did to my type 2 diabetes, and then they encourage another person and so on. But the really interesting level, which is the one at which the public health collaboration is trying to operate, is middle of the pyramid, and that's the health professionals, because the government, certainly in the UK, is showing no sign of changing. The Dietary Committee in the US was so disappointing. We can but conclude they're not looking to change anytime soon. But the idea that we can change halfway up the pyramid and we can get doctors and nurses and the more enlightened dietitians who then might see 1,000 patients or preside over a practice that may even have 10,000 patients on the books. If you get one of those doctors and you get them to realize that food can replace so many medications and make people slimmer and put their type 2 diabetes into remission and make them feel great and go and exercise and live great lives, you can transform another 10,000 people, bring them into the bottom-up revolution. So I think that's possibly the most exciting level, and that's where I will really happily give my time to support Sam Feltham and Campbell Murdoch and David Unwin, the doctors in the UK, Joe Reynolds. Those are the doctors in the UK that have got it and are going around speaking at conferences, trying to take on board not just their local practice, but the next borough local practice, and then perhaps the county local practice. And that's where I think change is going to come from.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to insert information and try to use it as a lever to pop something open. And you were mentioning before we recorded that one of your favorite pastimes is being on Twitter and calling out some of the nonsense. And you mentioned sort of the fake meat industry and how that's going. And so, I mean, while a lot of us are trying to focus on people just eating real food, and you said a lot of these basic things, you eat animal products, fat, and you kind of back into a low carb diet. But then you see companies like Beyond Meat who go public and soar to a $6 billion market cap. I don't even know where to start when I try to focus people's attention on what really matters. And so, I mean, there's so many different things with the fake meat. I'm sure you've dug into a little bit, but I mean, people, I think, believe that they're making the right nutritional choice. When you look at the ingredients, it's obviously insane. And then also the environmental choice. And I think that's even where people go, yeah, I mean, obviously I like eating meat more and it's great, but it's not sustainable. What type of thoughts do you have around the sustainability and environmental impact regarding fake meat?
Oh, as you say, where to start on this one?
Exactly.
It's depressing. Okay, I have a confession to make. I was vegetarian for 20 years. A lot of people in this field were vegetarian. Sean Croxton was vegetarian. Nina Teicholz was vegetarian. Tom Norton was vegetarian. Leah Keith was obviously vegetarian, wrote a brilliant book. So I've come from that side, and we've all come from that side. And I think we thought at the time that we were doing the right thing. I never thought I was doing the right thing for my health, interestingly, because even 20, 30 years ago when I started being vegetarian back at college, I kind of knew, even before I studied nutrition, that I couldn't get everything I needed. I knew that liver was really healthy and I wasn't going to be eating liver anymore, but I kind of thought I could be healthy enough. And my main driver was I didn't want to eat the animals. The planet wasn't really being talked about at that time. When I was at college, we were protesting against apartheid in South Africa. We weren't protesting for planetary things. In fact, if anything, they were probably worried it was all going to cool down rather than warm up. So we had different things. But the planet thing now, the thing that actually drove me back to eating meat was, one, my health, when I realized if I wanted to get my vitamin D intake, I needed to eat 39 eggs or maybe a couple of 100 grams of oily fish each day. And then you realize you're never going to eat 39 eggs. And people say, oh yeah, you can just take a supplement. Well, then you may as well not eat. And then you have to accept that we have only been able to be vegetarian, let alone vegan, since we have had supplements, which is decades. It's not centuries. Veganism cannot be something that we are intended to be, because but for vitamins and supplements, there is no way we could be able to do this. We would die out from the deficiencies that ensue from following a solely plant-based diet. But then it was really interesting when you get into not just the nutrition side of food, but the food provenance. And then when you realize that the Soil Association, which is one of the UK organisations, is starting to tweet how many harvests we might have left. And this is in a country as green and as beautiful and as wet as the UK. And they're saying in some places the topsoil is now so thin, whereas it used to be feet deep. It's now just barely millimeters deep. And then because we don't have the vegetation on the land, when there's the rains that we have in the UK, the mud is just running off into the rivers. And that mud is the topsoil. The topsoil is running into the rivers.
Can
and then, of course, we have...
Actually, just to explain to people who aren't aware of the ecosystem when it comes to farming, what topsoil is and why it's important.
Well, yeah, without, I don't know the biology of soil in the way that the Soil Association guys do, but I do know that without soil, we can't grow food in the traditional way. Now, the fake food companies have worked this out already. So they are already growing food without soil. So if you go into the supermarket, particularly if you're trying to buy fruit or vegetables out of season, almost certainly that has been grown upside down in a greenhouse, no soil around, with chemicals, with water dripped all over it to act as if there's upside down rain or something. It beggars belief. But that's how food can be grown in this James Bond horrific new world. But the way that food is supposed to be grown, if you go back to the agricultural revolution in the UK, then the people discovered the 3-field system. So they said you do the best for the food supply and the nutrients for the human beings, but basically you will just get more from all of your harvests if you have 3 fields. And in one year, you put your animals in the field, which in the UK would have been sheep and maybe goats and cattle. And then the next year, you put the crops in the field, and then all the manure, because of course the whole point of ruminants being so important to topsoil is that they've got this 4-stomach system. So they chew up the grass, and in so doing, they chew up billions of little microflora. They host them in their 4-stomach system, and then they poo them out or wee them out or regurgitate them out. But that's this cycle that's going on between the cow and the soil to replenish the topsoil. And when it was left doing that, that's when we had soil that was feet thick, that we knew would just keep giving us hard harvests ad infinitum. And as soon as you stop doing that, so of course the ideal would be the cows one year, the crops the next year, and then leave the field fallow. So you leave the field to recover from both the animals and then the crops that you've grown in it, and then you start the 3-year cycle again. So a farmer would have a number of fields ideally divisible by 3, and they just keep moving everything around so that every year they've got some animals that they can get milk and meat from, and then they've got some crops that they can get vegetables from, and they've got some fields recovering for the next cycle. And that's how it worked. And what we're doing now, particularly in America, I have to say, at least in the UK, you still see the cows and the sheep in the field because we've got great land. It's insane to do anything other than that. But in America, I think you've also got the land and the grass, and yet you seem to quite often put them in sheds on concrete floors and then turn to the fields and grow soybeans and grains in the fields to feed the cows in the concrete shed. And the cow can't digest the grains and the soy any more arguably than humans can. And yet that's what ends up happening. So the cow gets sick. The human doesn't benefit that much because the cow hasn't had any vitamin D. It hasn't been outside. It's not a healthy cow. It's probably been given loads of antibiotics because it's been so sick during its poor, sad lifetime. And you did absolutely nothing to help the planet. In fact, you raped the planet because you took the fields that the cows could have been grazing in and you decided to grow soybeans and grains instead. So That is just insanity to me. And that's what we've got to stop.
Right. And I'm clearly not in favor of that either. But I think that when people conflate that, the idea that it's either lab grown meat or that, and there's no in between, you need to just open up a textbook or like take a lesson in history and realize that this is sort of a new paradigm shift that we've had to stuff all of these animals in a pen and feed them really fake food. It's not how we've done it for many, many thousands of years.
Yeah.
So a question for you is, if it was for ethical reasons before we didn't want to eat the animals, was there a transition period where you had to get over that mentally or emotionally, or how did you make that shift? So I think that, that's the one concern that I would have to have with people, is that the direct ethical things of obviously taking animals' life for your own sustenance. However, then you look at plowing through fields, you're going to have some taking of life there with crop kills in the matter. But how do you think about that, and how was your transition?
Yeah, good question. It was easy at one level and it wasn't easy at another level. And it's never going to be easy at the level of eating an animal. I do struggle with that still. But I've come to the point that I've realized my health requires me to eat the things that come from animals, and the planet health requires me to eat the things that come from animals. And then you almost get to the point where I'm going to get hate mail on this, I'm sure, but you actually get quite angry with vegans because they're not playing their part in the protection of topsoil. It's like, I would rather be eating the beans and whatever you lot are doing, but we have to be eating well-sourced ruminants. So you get to know your butcher. It's the grass-fed animals. I agree with you, vegans. We should be able to fight together on getting these animals out of sheds. But unfortunately, we do need ruminants grazing on the topsoil if we are going to be able to feed the planet the natural way ongoing. If you want to go down the route with Cargill and the agri-chemical companies, it really is a plot out of a James Bond movie, because they will then be the only people who can feed the world, because soil will have disappeared. And if that's the route that you want to go down, then that's a really, really scary route. That's way more scary than anything that you think is going on with the planet. Right. So I just got to the point where I thought, I got to play my part. And actually, there is nothing that any of us can eat. This is the Leah Keith point in the vegetarian myth. There is nothing that any of us can eat for which nothing has died. There just isn't. Right. If you honestly think your grain has not killed rabbits, voles, birds, worms, goodness knows what else, probably a domestic cat, while that massive combine harvester has been traveling down that field, then you're in denial, you're being naive. Okay, you might not want to see the animal on your plate, but you're eating animal in your grain. There's no way they got that out of your grain or your soy. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth.
Right. And I think another thing that people don't realize, White Oak Pastures just released a really interesting study on this, is that to sequester carbon in the soil, we need that topsoil. And this is another thing where it comes back to the environmental things, like where you were saying that if we don't restore this topsoil, yes, we can't feed people, but also there's a net negative carbon sink for raising animals properly in restoring some of this topsoil.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was one of the best presentations at the Public Health Collaboration Conference just last month was a guy called Patrick Holden, who used to be part of the Soil Association and then set up an organization called the Sustainable Food Trust. He wanted to widen it beyond soil to look at everything from farm to fork, basically what's going to be best for human health, what's going to be best for animal health, and what's going to be best for the planet health. And he gave a talk on exactly this, the role that soil and animals and ruminants need to play in this whole ecosystem, and what happens if we go down the plant-based route. And he can paint a pretty bleak picture, and you just then realize we've got to be grown-ups about this. It can't be, oh, I don't want to eat anything that's furry, or I might eat a fish, but I can't eat anything that's been bouncing around a field. Guys, we've got to be grown up about this, because we are part of the cycle of life. If we really want to do it the right way, then we need to take down the fences and the buildings and remember that we're food as well. Right. So we should be food for wild animals. So if you really want to play the game as you think it should be played, then let's just level the playing field and let the big cats eat us, and the big cats eat anything else that they want, and domestic cats eat all the birds, and just let it go free rep. But we're putting lines in places that shouldn't really be there, and it will have consequences.
And so I know that you, changing topics a little bit, I know that you also recently have been focusing on the role of fiber and the amount of fiber people should be eating. So what, I think this is stuff that not a lot of people are talking about, but what is your stance here, and what have you found in your research?
Okay, so the top level fiber is really, really simple. So there are three macronutrients: fat, protein, and carbohydrate. We have essential fats, we have essential proteins, we do not have essential carbohydrates. We do not need to eat carbohydrates. And people say, oh, that's really contentious. And then you go to the best quotation that we all use in our presentations is from the Panel on Macronutrients, 2005 US government document that said apparently the lower limit of carbohydrate is 0, provided you eat enough fat and protein. So all of our needs can be met from fat and protein. So you start off with that principle, we don't need carbohydrate. Then what I did in my talk was go through carbohydrates 101. So you've got the monosaccharides, which is just one sugar. Think of them as sugar. You've got the disaccharides, that's 2 sugars. You've got the polysaccharides, that's many sugars. And all that fiber is the indigestible many sugars. So the indigestible polysaccharides. So it's a subset of carbohydrates. And if we don't need carbohydrates, we therefore don't need fiber. Full stop.
Interesting. And so what about the people that, oh, well, gut health and microbiome and just throw out all these words that are associated with fiber?
So the gut microbiome, I think it's an interesting one, actually. There's obviously a lot of research going into it at the moment. I'm not yet convinced it's a maker of anything. I am fairly convinced it's a marker. So I think a good gut microbiome can be a good indication of a healthy person. But I don't know if a good microbiome makes that person healthy or if it just reflects the fact that they are healthy. So the things that make a great gut microbiome, and I'll mention all the ones that I can think of that have nothing to do with fiber whatsoever. First of all, you should have great parents, particularly your mum. You should be born naturally because that's how your mum then gives you some of her gut flora during the birthing process. You should be breastfed naturally for as long as mum is able to do that, ideally several months, if not a couple of years. So again, mum's given you all of her great flora. You don't take antibiotics as a child. Ideally, you don't take them as an adult either, in both circumstances, unless your life depends on it. You don't take antacids, particularly as a child. The idea that some children need antacids is incredible. You generally eat good food. That doesn't have to include fiber. But we do know, and there was a great experiment by a guy who's really big on the microbiome. So he might not like me saying I'm not convinced we need fiber. He's sort of real fiber microflora man in the UK. Professor Tim Spector, he put his son on an experiment where he put him on a junk food diet for, I think it was only about 14 days, maybe 21. And he managed to wipe out half of his boys' gut flora in a very, very short period of time on McDonald's, basically the junk food diet. So you don't eat bad food because we know that bad food feeds the bad gut flora, which then dominate the good gut flora and will quite quickly impact your overall microbiome and lead it to be a lot less good than it was before you started eating the junk. And then, of course, you've got things like probiotics, which don't contain fiber. So things like kefir, sauerkraut, fermented foods, natural live yogurt, which is probably where the doctors that I was studying all those years ago, that's probably where they were ahead of their time. And all of that is going to make for a great gut microbiome. And I haven't mentioned fiber. And I actually then at this point of the presentation put up a picture of beans on toast and say, look, if you've done all of that and you've got a great microbiome, I really don't think beans on toast is going to make any difference. And if you've done none of that, you weren't born naturally, you're born by cesarean, you weren't breastfed, you took loads of antibiotics as a child, maybe antacids, you had a really bad diet, beans on toast is not going to help you either, because it's about so much more than that. So I'm in the place that I know it's not essential. That's a fact. You can't argue against that. If carbohydrates are not essential, fiber is not essential. So the only debate we're having around fiber is, can it be beneficial? And I'm just not seeing evidence that is saying fiber per se, fiber in and of itself is beneficial. So you might see a study that says, oh, the people who ate vegetables and nuts had some biomarker. It might have been the gut flora. It might have been some other marker of heart disease or glucose or whatever. They come up with some marker and they say, oh, the guys that ate more fruit and veg and nuts did better. Again, was that because they were healthy people? Was it because those foods are healthy? Because we know that there's some good nutrients in nuts and particularly vegetables, less so in fruit. Or was it the fibrous part of the food? Are you telling me that it's all the nutrients in kale or the bit of kale that we can't digest, which is what the fiber is? And I'm just really struggling to believe that the bit we can't digest, the bit that ends up down the pan, is in some way fantastic for us. I'm really struggling to see if it's even beneficial. Right. And of course, we know that it can harm. And I think the increase in gut disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, bloating, all of the things that people might come into you with as a doctor, take them off fiber. There was a great study, 2012, a study over in the Far East, and they took people off fiber and every single symptom of quite severe irritable bowel syndrome disappeared. And they then said to the tens of people in the study, do you want to go back to eating fiber? And most of them said, no, I'm sticking with the zero fiber diet. Thank you.
Which is exactly what I mean, I'm not practicing any longer, but when I did, the main thing to treat most gut problems was just to remove people on like basically elimination diet first, taking fiber out of their diet. So yeah, it's one of those very, very clear indicators to me. Well, Zoe, thank you for coming on and chat about all this stuff. And thank you so much for all the work you do, calling out all the nonsense on Twitter and the like. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, so zoeharcombe.com, zoeharcombe.com is my site. And the nonsense, I basically dissect each week. So my main thing that I do now is I send out a Monday newsletter. I've been doing that since 2009. And it takes a study from the past week. So the one that I'm looking at the moment is one you may have seen on Twitter, the effects of red meat, white meat, and non-meat protein sources on lipoprotein measures in the context of low compared with high saturated fat intake, a randomized controlled trial. A brilliantly conceived and executed study, but it had a couple of fundamental flaws. So what I do is basically take the actual academic paper, not just the media headlines from the previous week, and in a couple of thousand words, put it into as simple terms as I can with an exec summary. So you've got a 30-second read as well as a maybe 5-minute read. And it will just show why you don't have to worry about this latest study, because that is pretty much the conclusion of every single paper I ever look at.
Well, thank you so much for doing that to work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. The hour has flown.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.